Welcome to this episode of Mississippi Stories. I'm your host, Marshall Ramsey. I'm editor-at-large at Mississippi Today. And if you haven't checked out Mississippi Today, you can go to MississippiToday.org. We have a lot of great coverage, but we also have a lot of different back episodes of Mississippi Stories, and would love you to check them out. And of course, you can see my cartoons as well. Our guest today is somebody that, it's funny, I moved here about 25 years ago to Mississippi, so I'm a newcomer. I worked for the Clarion Ledger at that time, and I had a great boss, David Hampton, and worked with a great editorial team. Well, one of our competitors, at least in their minds, was competitor because they're always competing for awards, was Lloyd Gray, who was up at the Northeast Mississippi Daily Journal at that time up in Tupelo. But over the years, I've got to really respect him first through his writings and then getting to know him. And it seems like yesterday, but a few years ago, and we'll talk about this a little bit, he retired from the newspaper business and became the executive director of the Phil Hardin Foundation, which is a statewide education philanthropy, which is based in Meridian. So he has had some previous experience in Meridian, and he moved back, and we'll cover all that too as well. Lloyd, it's great to be with you. And of course, I left out of the introduction, of course, you come from a very famous family. You did not get into the family business of becoming Bishop of Mississippi for the Episcopal Church. You left that to your brother and your dad.
Managed to avoid that. Yes.
Yeah, you got out and got into something a little more stable, the newspaper business.
Right. Yeah. I used to say the only business that was less well thought of by the people than the government itself. So,
it's like, well, I could have become a lawyer, but I thought I'd just go ahead and dive into the newspaper business. But, we mentioned Meridian, and that's where you are now. And it was really nice. I got to see you on a trip over speaking. I think it was the Rotary Club, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah,
that's
my
right.
brain, COVID, I never had it, but just the whole pandemic thing, I can't remember anything. But,
I bought your book for my grandson, and you signed it. So that very same day at the Max.
Yes. Thank you. I appreciate that. All those proceeds go to Kroger, because to feed my kids. And I want to say thank you for that. You started out, we didn't start out in Meridian. Of course, when your dad is an Episcopal priest, you tend to bounce around the state quite a bit. And you did get to bounce around the state. But when you were in sixth grade, you bounced to Meridian. And at that time, you fell in love with writing and working for newspapers, and you worked for the Meridian Star. You did sports reporting, didn't you?
That's right. I sort of fell into that. I was an ardent sports fan and had determined by that time that my earlier goal to be a Major League Baseball player probably was not going to pan out. So, I was just ecstatic when a high school classmate, well, not a classmate, he was a couple of years ahead of me, who had worked in the sports department at the Star, came to me and said, they're looking to replace me. He was going off to Ole Miss that fall, and they'd gotten very dependent on him to cover a lot of sports, and to not just high school, but college stuff too, and to put out the paper on certain days, and while the sports editor played golf. And so it was, it was a great opportunity. They're going to pay you $1.65 an hour to go watch games. And I said, man, that's a great gig. And so I took it, and that was my journalism education at the Meridian Star when I was a junior and senior in high school working in the sports department.
Isn't it amazing? I remember when I first started at the newspapers, I think as long as you just did the work, they didn't care. And they gave you more work to do because they figured out you'd do the work on that. But you're in high school at this point, and I was thinking about the look on my dad's face when I told him I was going to go become a cartoonist on that. What was your dad's reaction when you said, I really want to go work at the newspaper. I'm really enjoying this.
Well, he was very supportive, and he was always supportive of anything, reasonably constructive that we decided to do. People would ask, well, how did you manage not to, go into the priesthood? And I said, well, there was never any pressure at home, certainly, to do anything other than what I felt called to do. And I never felt called to go into the priesthood, but he was the principal reason that I was such a big sports fan, because he was a huge sports fan and raised my brother and me in that fashion. And so he would take us to St. Louis every summer to see the Cardinals. He loved the Cardinals,
Oh, wow.
and that's been a multi-generational passion of our family. He went to every high school football. He played high school football, played high school basketball, and went to all the games wherever he was. And my brother played football, and we followed them all around, both in Oxford when we were there for his 10th grade year, and 11th and 12th grade in Meridian. So, and we love that. Some of my greatest memories are with my dad, or watching ball games on TV or in person, going to college games or professional games. And so he was as excited as I was about it, really. And of course it was, my mother was real worried about me being out until 12:30 or 1 a.m. every weekend night down there with these people that she wasn't so sure about were the best of influences on me, and they probably weren't, because they were newspaper people after all. But I learned a whole heck of a lot, and it gave me my marketable skill for when I was needing summer work in college, and I was editor of the college paper at Millsaps, and did some other things, all the while planning to go to law school when I got out and save the world in Mississippi politics. And I got to thinking toward the end of my time in college that probably wasn't, like Major League Baseball, that wasn't going to pan out either, because I just felt like I probably was a little out of sync with the average Mississippi voter, so I probably wouldn't be elected to anything. And so I got to thinking about, well, what would I do? And would I go to graduate school? Would I do something different? And so I said, well, I got this marketable skill. I'll take a year or two out. I went to work in Greenville at the Delta Democrat-Times as a reporter. I had interned there. Hardin Carter owned the paper. And 40 something years later, I was still trying to decide what I was going to do after that first year or two. But it's worked out pretty well.
You mentioned Hardin Carter, and of course your dad too, Duncan Gray Jr. And I think about your dad's, this quote from your dad is one that's always been one of my favorites. For these are times which not only try men's souls, but also infect and poison them. The seeds of anger and hatred, bitterness and prejudice are always widely sown. And as Christians, we need to do our utmost to cast them out. And that was September 30th, 1962. Your dad had an awful lot of courage and wasn't afraid to step out to speak not only the gospel, but also what he felt was personally right at a time when people weren't doing a lot of things personally right. Hardin Carter Jr., same way. I mean, you were working for another person who had a different pulpit, per se, but was able to sit down and write things. Just having those influences in your life, did it influence you to sit there and say, okay, I'm going to try to put down my pen to paper and try to make a difference in Mississippi?
Absolutely. My dad never considered himself an activist, a civil rights leader, or anything like that, although in many ways he was. But what he considered himself to be was a priest of the church. And he did consider what his messages, such as the one that you read, were about the gospel. And that was how he saw the gospel being played out in the world, that it was, as Christians, it was our duty, or as the prayer book used to say, our bounden duty to be out in the world, reconciling people to one another. And so that was what motivated him. He was far from the sort of secular do-good type person who has principles that are devoid of a foundation in a deeply rooted faith. And one of the things that he was so that made him, I think, as Will Campbell, in writing a book about him, said that he opposed the culture but was never alienated from it. And a lot of that, he never got bitter. He never condemned people who he thought weren't seeing the light, because he believed that we all had fallen from grace, and that we were all sinners, and that racism was a sin. Therefore, it would never be fully eradicated, but it had to be confronted. And I think that is, the key, that he did not see people as bad people. He saw people who were created in the image of God, but who happened to have, some blind spots and just needed to be loved, and in the tough love way sometimes. But so he was an enormously influential person, by far the most influential person in my life. I never had to be as courageous as he was, and I don't know that I could have been if the circumstances ever required it. But and my mother the same way. She had also an enormous influence on me, and she was one who got me really. She was a very good writer herself, and worked with me on writing, and encouraged my writing. And so when I sort of evolved from the idea of, well, sports writing could be a career. I love sports, but I didn't think I wanted to write about sports. I wanted to make a difference in Mississippi in particular. And the fact that I enjoyed writing, was pretty decent at it, and enjoyed public affairs, public events, current events, made the melding of those two into journalism something that was attractive to me. I was never drawn, as so many people are, to journalism just for the love of it as a craft.
Yeah.
That was not what motivated me. I was motivated by this idea of using it as a place to do good and to make the community and the state a better place, a sort of community building role that I always saw that the Daily Journal in Tupelo emphasized so strongly, which was why I was attracted there. So Hardin Carter was an early role model for me in what a newspaper person could do to be a voice of reason in a time of just craziness, and to be out there caring deeply about his community and all the humdrum activities and the just normal course of life things that a local newspaper deals with. It's one thing. I just thought it was, looking from afar and reading about him and hearing him, I said, it's all about these high-minded things there's always a crusade, there's always something going on that is, pushing forward. And then I would go, and then I went to work at the DDT, and the daily grist of that was just life in the community, which is the way it should be. And so I guess the answer to your question is yes. Obviously, both of those people had an influence on me. And Hardin was he was just tenacious in every way, in every element of his life. And I got to experience the flavor of having him as an editor for a brief period. And he really helped shape my view of, what a newspaper should be and how a newspaper reporter or editor should be.
Yeah, I've always said, and I know it's, when you're a creative person or you're a writer, whenever, you're supposed to hate your editor. But, I always tell people, I said, well, yeah, I'm a 2-time Pulitzer finalist because I had David Hampton as my editor, because he could always tell me, even if when he disagreed with me, he's like, no, that's not a good cartoon. I don't like what you're doing there. But I mean, it's always important to have those influences in your life. And, Mississippi's been pretty lucky when it comes to newspapers. We've had a lot of talented people running around the state. And of course, you're you're a 4-time Emmerich Award winner. You pretty much were able to nail one every decade. It seemed like you were working there. It's like it went around. Let's see here. I've got it.
Those were at 3 different papers, and so it just kind
Yeah.
of shows I was a journeyman. I couldn't hold a job.
Yeah, well, I was going to bring that. That was my next question. I was like, "What is there some kind of defect there that we need to know about? Why you kept bouncing around so much? And did your wife want to leave you when you were like telling her, honey, we're moving yet again?" You did
Well,
86 of the Sun Herald, 91 in Meridian Star. So you keep going back and forth to Meridian, and we'll touch on that in a second. And then 2, of course, at the Northeast Mississippi Daily Journal in 98 and 2007.
That was I was there. I was at the Journal for 23 years, from 92 to 2015, and so that was a long stop for me.
Yeah.
And yes, before we moved to Tupelo, Sally said to me, "All right, you're gonna buy me a cemetery plot there. I'm not moving again." Of course, here we are back in Meridian.
You're in Meridian.
Yeah, but
I was going to ask, did she buy a cemetery plot for you after you told?
Yeah, right. That was probably on her mind at some point there, but no, it's it was. I actually worked for the Sun Herald for 12 years. That's the Coast paper. There were 2 papers when I went to work for them, and my connection from Greenville, Pick Furman, who had actually hired me for the internship there, he was the managing editor of the DDT, had gone to the Coast, and he hired me away from the DDT in Greenville to come to what was then called the South Mississippi Sun. It's a new morning paper, just a few years old, that they had opened up the ownership, which was based in South Carolina at the time. It started a morning paper, the dominant afternoon paper on the Gulf Coast, was a little worried about Mobile or New Orleans, the Newhouse company coming in and starting a morning paper. So they started one, and I worked for that paper for a while. Then they sent me to Jackson as the Capital correspondent, and I was working for both papers. And they were competing news staffs, and I was the only reporter who worked for both papers. And so that was one of my first political. I was writing about politics, but there was also the politics of having to deal with the editors of both of these competing newspapers, like in the old days, the Clarion Ledger and the Jackson Daily News, and trying to figure out, okay, I gave them this story first last time, so it's time for me to hold off and give the afternoon paper a story that would be ready for the morning paper. It had to deal with that kind of thing. So, and then I went back down there as an editor, and I went back to state government, then to Meridian, then to Tupelo, then back to Meridian. So yeah, I've been a Mississippi nomad. That's kind of been my.
But I always tell people you can't understand Mississippi just driving from your house to your office. I mean, it is kind of good, and I think you managed to cover just about every region as well. And I think it's something that probably serves you well in what you're doing now. And we'll talk about what you're doing now in just a second. I did interview Jack Reed Jr. a little bit, and I know your time in Tupelo and the mission of the Northeast Mississippi Daily Journal was, there was kind of something about Tupelo, but it's like everybody seemed to be rowing in the same direction. And I think about your columns, and I went back and read some of them again, and I remembered some of them, but it was, education was important, obviously, training, business, just the things that make a community. And I saw a quote from you, and I can't find it naturally in my notes, but I remember basically that you believe in building a community from the ground up. So, I mean, you look at all these things that you believed when you were in education, and when you got the call to join the Phil Hardin Foundation, it really wasn't that huge of a leap, was it, for you to go into that job?
No, not at all. I was, I felt like I was in the community building business before that. And at the Daily Journal, education was our very top priority, public education in the community and in Mississippi. I had written about public education as a reporter. I covered the Capitol in the days leading up to the Education Reform Act. I was actually back as an editor on the Coast when it was passed that year, but was there the night that Buddy Newman gavelled the House to adjournment to kill public kindergartens, and I saw a lot of that, wrote a lot about it, and continue to write about it as a columnist and editorial writer in all of my stations around the state. And really, I have, it's been kind of a seamless transition because there's a little less pressure, a little less stress when you're, working with people to fund worthwhile projects. And, there's usually at the newspaper, when the phone rings, it's going to be somebody who is mad about something, 2/3 of the time, my experience, particularly when you're an editor, and that's what they, I want to talk to the editor. And so you get an earful several times a day. And when they call the foundation, it's they're very nice because
you have money.
That's right. So, but in terms of the the mission, it's very similar. The contacts that I had made in the journalism world with people in education and in state government, and doing in philanthropy around the state, many of the same people I deal with in this work. And what I learned in my long newspaper career has been very helpful. And even just as you alluded to earlier, the knowledge of the state. And I think that's the main reason they hired me here. They wanted me to come was because they knew that I'd been around the state. They knew that I had, people I knew around the state, and that I was familiar with both Meridian and we have a particular local emphasis here in Meridian and Lauderdale County. The foundation does, but we also fund things statewide. So yes, in answer to your question, it has been a lot of the same type of work, and I don't feel that my mission in life has changed that much, really.
It's because I remember reading you were thinking about, maybe I have 5 more years. And I mean, about the time that you switched over, I mean, it was when really the business started changing. Instead of being, sitting down and actually thinking about what you're going to write about and then having one deadline, and suddenly you're having to tweet and you're having to, it's become more of a 24-hour, 7-day a week, regurgitate whatever you can spit out to keep the beast fed kind of thing. So you're right. I think it did come at a good time for you to do that.
Marshall, I used to think that once every 24 hours was, just impossible to really get anything right, get anything in context, get anything. That was an unreasonable expectation. And when it started to be every 24 minutes you had to do something, that just was not me. And that's one of the things that drove me out of, or I don't say drove me out, that made me think, somebody else can probably do this better than I can. In fact, I'm sure there's somebody who can do it better than I can. And, you look around and you say, what I have brought all these years was valuable, but somebody else can be of higher value to the future of this newspaper than because I don't have these skills, and I don't have you saw me before we started this. I had a hard time getting my camera on here to come on with you. So, and I'm just glad. I'm not even on Facebook. I'm on Facebook, but I'm not on Facebook. I don't tweet. I don't do any of that stuff. And at the Hardin Foundation, I don't do anything like that because we're not in a position where we have to be out and in front of people all the time, because people know where we are and they come to us. So
tell us about Phil Hardin, because he seemed like a really ahead of his time visionary business person.
He was, bread is bread, especially back in the old days when it was just all white bread, and so his genius was marketing. And he had, I remember growing up here at Hardin's Bread was the the dominant brand. And it was because you heard these jingles all the time. You heard, he had, in the early days of live television commercials, he'd have bands on playing the Hardin bread boogie jingle, or there was some kind of something like that. And I remember, that's what I said, Hardin's bread, and it was just, in a what we would consider a rather primitive way, back in the 50s and 60s. He was a marketing genius, and so he built his bakeries, and they were scattered around the state, which is again one of the reasons when he established the foundation, he wanted to make it not just a Meridian area foundation, but a statewide foundation. Bakeries were headquartered here, but he also had bakeries in Jackson, Columbus, in Tupelo on the Gulf Coast. I think even in Hattiesburg at some point. And so he realized that he had generated his wealth from these areas around the state. And it also didn't hurt when he got the Southeast U.S. contract for McDonald's hamburger buns. But he felt like, he had no heirs, never married, had no children. And so he left so the story goes, he was reading the Wall Street Journal one day, and there was an article about the LBJ Foundation in Texas there. And he saw that it had tax benefits, but that it also did good. So he went into his tax lawyer's office and said, "Tom, can you get me one of them foundations?" And Tom Ward Sr. said, "Well, yes, Phil, we can do that." And but he was also very interested in education because he valued education, and he felt like he was thinking about, you talk about visionary, ahead of his time, sort of the George McLean, the Tupelo newspaper owner and publisher for many years, who recognized well ahead of others that a well-trained, well-educated population was going to lead to more prosperity for not only the individuals who are educated, but for their employers. And so it was kind of that enlightened self-interest. We've got to have an educated workforce, and that was one of the driving forces in his interest in education.
Looking at y'all have this is, and I don't know how old this is, but basically 53 million in assets. You award about 2.5 million annually. Tell us a little bit about some of the different groups that you fund and some of the different projects you weren't, and things that you're particularly proud of that y'all been able to help with.
Sure, and that is a little out of date. Our assets right now are about 71 million.
Hey, can you take care of my stock portfolio for me, please?
Well, I'm going to tell you, we have an investment committee here that is extraordinary, led by Marty Davidson, who is chairman of the Southern Pipe and Supply Company. And Marty does an outstanding, we're one of the few foundations that doesn't farm all of our assets out to an investment firm to handle. It's handled, the largest bulk of our money is handled internally. And it's worked for us over the years pretty well. And we took a big hit last year when the market crashed right as COVID was getting going, but we have rallied back. And so right now we're probably at about 3 million, a little over 3 million a year in distributions, grant distributions. And the charter is to improve the education of Mississippians. Well, that's a pretty broad category or mission. And we literally have done everything from early childhood to graduate school and after school programs and direct public school system and individual public school funding. But it runs the gamut, but we have several areas that we are particularly focused on these days: early childhood, literacy, teacher quality and retention, the leadership of schools, training and and recruitment of principals and superintendents. Just knowing the key element there. Access to educational opportunity, and we refer to that as equity of access to educational opportunity. In other words, we value any types of programs that give kids who come from disadvantaged circumstances opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have. And there are lots of examples of that, but we have arts and cultural enrichment. The Hardin Foundation has a long history of funding things that help us to understand our history, help us to raise up our arts and literary heritage. From the Civil Rights Museum in Jackson to the Arts and Entertainment Experience here to the Children's Museum here. A lot of places around the state, like the Lauren Rogers Art Museum in Laurel. And of course, we zero in on the educational elements of these, the educational focus. We do after-school programs. We try to do, we fund a lot in the Meridian and Lauderdale County public school systems. We are continuous partners with them. A recent example would be the Lauderdale County school system is starting a pre-K classes next year, pre-K 4-year-old classes. They've never had them before. And so we put up the money to help them get it started. We put up $200,000 to help fund their first year at their 4 different campuses, elementary, 1 class at each campus, to kind of kickstart them. And they fund half of it, we fund half of it, and that will get them going for a program that we think is extraordinarily important. Meridian, we've done a lot with the Meridian Public School District. And at the pandemic, we went to them and said, what do you need that's related to what the stresses you're seeing here? Well, in Lauderdale County, it was they needed more behavioral therapists for the kids who would be traumatized even further by all the things that happened in the pandemic. In the Meridian system, it was school nurses. But we also emphasize, K-12 student achievement is kind of the core and the heart of what we do, anything that contributes to that. And even our mission statement, revised a few years ago, says, we want to improve educational and life outcomes for Mississippi children and youth. And some of that involves things that are not strictly academic, obviously. Boys and Girls Club, after school programs here that provide enrichment experiences to kids that they wouldn't have otherwise. At the state level, talking about the Civil Rights Museum, we contributed to that just from the standpoint of the big capital campaign for that. But we also have recently given a grant that assures that all 9th graders in our area for the next 3 years will be able to go visit the museum, and another pot of money that is for kids around the state. We have investments in the Delta. We have investments in South Mississippi on the coast, up in Northeast Mississippi. Our universities and colleges, we're pretty, we maintain partnerships with most of them. We have focused heavily in recent, historically on University of Mississippi, Mississippi State, Millsaps, but we also have done, HBCUs and Tougaloo and Southern and who am I leaving out? Belhaven, Mississippi College. So we have relationships with all of these, and a lot of these we like to see programs that come back to K-12 achievement. For example, at Ole Miss, we fund the Early Childhood Center up there, which trains teachers and child care workers and brings together discussions about that issue that can relate back then to K-12 achievement. At the state level, we try to be a catalyst. We were helpful, I think, in the recent digital Mississippi Connects program that the Mississippi Alliance of Nonprofits and Philanthropy helped put together. We put up some seed money for that. We have contributed to we've seeded a program for grants in local communities for the campaign for grade level reading. We try to be partners with other funders in making things happen, whatever is needed in the state. So we have a broader focus than a lot of foundations that specialize in education do, but it makes it both. It makes it challenging to decide what merits funding, but it also is something that is, gives us a lot of flexibility.
I was going to ask you about that process, because I know there's so much need in Mississippi, and I know that your phone rings quite a bit and your email box fills up with requests. What's kind of the process, and how do you decide what is worthy and who gets what? I mean, I know it's not you specifically, but I know I'll have a committee that decides it. That would be fun, though. Seriously, having the power, the sole power, just to say, like Oprah, here's a check for you and a check for you. That'd be kind of cool.
Well, I'm the door into which the grant seekers, they open the door through me, I guess you could say. That's not to say I'm the doorkeeper. I didn't mean to put it in that.
So you're the guy at the Wizard of Oz that opens the little window.
Yeah, that's right. The wizard back there is, or no, I shouldn't say that either. I was about to say the board is my wizard now, because that's not a good analogy. I am the first contact at the foundation. The board, my board of directors, is delegates to the executive director, building relationships, seeking opportunities, being out there representing the foundation, and trying to determine what the needs are and how we can best meet them. And so what I will do is discuss, we ask people before they submit a grant. We get grants blindly submitted on our website fairly regularly, but we've really made an effort to try to tell folks, touch base with us first, email me or call me. Let's talk through it, see if it's something that we have both the interest and the capacity to do, and so that you don't waste your time, spend a lot of time. We have a fairly involved, you got to gather a lot of documents, particularly if you're a first-time grant seeker, to prove that you're a 501c3 and all of that, submit budget documents and all that kind of thing. So, we ask people to talk with us first, and then we guide them through the process without any guarantees. But I will usually, I may make a site visit if it's an existing program. I may, have several conversations with people before they actually submit the proposal. And I've got in my mind kind of how much money we have to give this year, how much we've already committed, and trying to, keep in mind that we have certain priority areas, subject areas, and geographic areas. And so, really, after that initial conversation, they may submit a draft to me, and I'll advise them as to how I think they should. And, I'll become an editor again, and I'll say, you really ought to emphasize this more, or I think our board would be more interested in hearing more about this. And then ultimately, it's the board that makes the decision. I make a recommendation to the board. I go, we send out a packet several days ahead of the board meeting, and I usually am keeping them abreast of who I've been talking to and getting feedback from them on whether they think that's a good idea or not. And then I'll take the written proposal to them, and we'll talk about it in a board meeting. We have 10 board meetings a year, so we have very little bureaucracy, and there are only 2 employees and a board of now 8 people. And so we have that board meeting essentially once a month, and they make decisions right there on whether to fund or how much to fund or whether not to fund. Sometimes they'll say, well, this is a good idea, but, I don't think we should fund this much quite this early. Let's cut it back a little bit. Or, so I tell people that I'm going to take their proposal to the board, but I don't guarantee them anything until the board is met. And we have an excellent board of people who really ask a lot of good questions and do their job. But I tell you, they're also every single one of them is fervently committed to public education in Mississippi, and they are people who really care about the state and this community here in Meridian. They're all from Meridian, which is interesting. I mean, we've got a board that makes grants statewide, but they're all here, and that's sort of Mr. Hardin's. That's 57 years ago, the way he set it up. Everybody was from Meridian, and that's the way it's continued through the years.
Well, they didn't have Zoom 57 years ago, so
that's right. That's right.
Statewide meetings.
Well, and our board members do not miss meetings. I mean, they are here, and when they come on, there's a clear expectation. Your service is about attending meetings, and so it's rare that a member misses.
You probably have good snacks too.
No, yeah, well, we have good lunches all the time. Well, during the one that we did have a few Zoom meetings, or I should say, old-fashioned conference call meetings the first couple of times, and then we had some people Zoom in at our in-person meetings. But we had, starting I guess about in May or June of last year, we decided to have meetings in person, but we were socially distanced. Everybody wore a mask. We didn't eat lunch. Everybody had a box lunch they could take with them. And just at our last meeting, well, I guess at our April meeting, we all looked around at each other and said, hey, we're all vaccinated. And so we just kind of all took off our masks. And this past meeting, we had lunch together, and it was very nice.
It is quite a liberating feeling to suddenly realize, oh, so that's what you look like. I haven't seen your face in a while. So definitely on that. Well, in the time we have left, Lloyd, I'd like to do this all day, but I'm going to have to scoot here in a second. But you've had 3 tours of duty in Meridian, and you've seen it, have good days and bad days. It seems like downtown Meridian's got a lot of cool things going on right now. I know the Max Museum is fantastic. You've got what the Mississippi Children's Museum has built there. I can't wait to see it. It
is fabulous.
Yeah,
it's truly fabulous. Of course, we're a funder, so I would
you're a little
say that. Yeah. I would say that. I mean, I wouldn't say it's fabulous. I'd say it's really, you really should come see it if it weren't fabulous.
Yeah.
It is fabulous.
It's great, but I mean, how do you see? I mean, you've been in community. Of course, Tupelo, you were there for a long time, and you saw the challenges when of course, the furniture making business started having some pressures. But then Toyota came along, and it's like that was a really good day. And I mean, talk about some of the good things that you see going on in Meridian, and what are some of the challenges?
Well, Meridian, has long had that sort of curse of being the place that everybody said for years and years and years. Meridian has so much untapped potential. Meridian has so much potential. We're at the convergence of 2 interstate highways. We're a great location. The downtown infrastructure is, I think, the best in the state. And there's so many. The education system, while the public school systems have their challenges, there is a history of valuing education in Meridian, and there's a seamless web of education system here that has a great community college and Mississippi State branch, which is growing and which is very connected with the needs of the community. And so you've got a lot of advantages. Meridian is, I think, people ask me, what's the difference in Tupelo and Meridian? A lot of it's just a mindset. I mean, really, Meridian has stopped, sometime back a few decades ago, Meridian really stopped believing in itself, stopped believing that it could do what it was capable of doing, I think. And there was some factionalism and division, which just never got completely rooted out. But I really think the culture is changing today. And I think it's due to a lot of people who have said, it's time for us to be, not to be the place with potential, but to be the place that's actually, coming alive with economic opportunity. And the arts are very important in that. What's happening in downtown, they had a huge revival of the 3 Foot Festival this past weekend. Thousands of people downtown. It was great. There is, of course, the Riley Center, the Temple Theater, the 3 Foot Hotel, which is going to be a real destination hotel, I think. A 1929 Art Deco structure, 16 stories. It's been empty for 20 plus years. It's being converted into a Marriott, 4-star hotel, and I think that's going to be another catalyst. So the economic development organizations get more people behind it. It's upped its game a good bit. There are a lot of things that are just about to happen. So I'm excited about Meridian's future, and I think that the old culture of, well, this is, I sort of said, in Tupelo, people would say, well, this is Tupelo, we can do that. And in Meridian, the mindset might be closer to, well, this is Meridian, we can't do that. And I think that is changing. I think the aspiration and the belief and the self-image is improving. And I see that as being very, very hopeful development for the future.
Yeah, I agree with you about downtown's just beautiful, and the Riley Center and the Opera House is one of my favorite venues in the state. It's just the story, and just you go in there and it's breathtaking when you're in there. Last question, and then I'll let you go. And this is probably a short answer, maybe hard on this one, but you're still very tapped into education. You're on the ground, you're seeing things, you're talking with people who are on the ground, who are making a difference and so forth. Where do you think we are in Mississippi with education, and where do you think that we need to go? Because we've got a lot of issues, everything from brain drain to so forth. I feel like that right now that we really need to put a lot of emphasis on education, but what should that emphasis be?
Well,
I thought I'd save the easy one for last.
That's a question that is a subject for my daily debate with myself and with others. And I think that probably we have had too much of a divide. And I'm one who has always believed that we underfunded our schools, that MAEP should be fully funded. I was a supporter of Initiative 42. I do think that our schools continue to need to be funded, but sometimes we get into that dichotomy, of we line up on sides and nobody can see what valid point the other side might have. And I think that there are some areas to find some common ground in education policy in Mississippi. And there's no question that one of the things that I think we have a potential is on early childhood. Much more emphasis there, much more state funding there, much more emphasis on these collaboratives. Recently we have had indications that they're doing very well. They're successful. They're high quality, and we just need to give more kids. But they only serve like 8,000 kids. We need to give more kids more opportunities at that level. The earlier, the better. I remain convinced that early early childhood, 0 to 5, is the most important, important area to focus on to make kids ready to do better in school. That said, we don't need to lose sight of the fact that we have had some pretty impressive statistics recently in reading and math improvement in our schools. And public education in Mississippi, as some people will say or tend to think, is not a lost cause. It is improving. It is getting better. And what pains me and what makes me suffer is to see how unequal and the opportunities are, and the opportunities for a good, well-funded education are, when you've got districts like in suburban Jackson, which are high performing, well supported, and you've got districts elsewhere that have been just disinvested, and the community has not rallied around them, and you have kids who don't have access to advanced courses or other opportunities. This is not just the buzzword of the moment I'm talking about. Equity is a huge issue in Mississippi education. And I think we need to recognize that, and we need to address it. And, some of those funding formulas that were opposed by people like me, try to address those equity issues by making the richer districts, a little less flush, and helping out the poorer districts. And I think the politics of it all got caught up, so we lost an emphasis on equity there. But it just is it is bordering on criminal for a child's educational opportunity to be reliant upon the property tax level in his or her district. And so, early childhood and equity of opportunity in public school districts, I think, are two critical areas.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. And thank you so much for what you give back to Mississippi and what the Phil Hardin Foundation gives back to Mississippi as well. I've really enjoyed sitting down and talking with you.
Thank you, Marshall, and thank you for your great work. And you're a true Mississippi treasure, and we value you greatly.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, gosh, that's a great place to end right there. In fact, I may replay this on bad days. That'd be great. Boy, thank you. I can't wait to get over Meridian soon. I hadn't been doing much traveling. In fact, we were supposed to do an event at the Max, and then literally the week the pandemic started. So hopefully we can get that rescheduled.
Well, come soon.
Will do. All right. Thank you.
Bye.